Dragon Con. I'm Caro, the BritTrack director, and we're super excited to have with us to talk about Holmesian archetypes and how the Sherlock Holmes character shows up in other media. With me today, I have private investigator Bob Nygaard, who's a retired NYPD transit police officer and private investigator. Hi, Bob. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. We also have with us Keith DeCandido. Keith DeCandido is an author of tons of stuff, including 2 Sherlock Holmes pastiches in 2 Baker Street irregular anthologies, and too much other stuff is to list here, though he has written several Doctor Who stories and edited a Doctor Who anthology, which he's obligated to mention because it's the BritTrack. Hi, Keith. How are you doing today?
I'm doing peachy. Glad to be here.
Yay. I also have with us Trisha Wooldridge, who is an author, editor, and poet. Her recent work is in the Shirley Jackson Award-winning Twisted Book of Shadows, and she is in the up-and-coming Don't Turn Out the Lights tribute to Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. You can find her at a novelfriendly.com, or a novelfriend.com. Hi, Trisha. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you again for having me. Hi, DragonCon.
Awesome. I also have Jennifer Blackstream, who's an author of urban fantasy, and you can find Jennifer at jenniferblackstream.com. Hi, Jennifer. How are you today?
Hi, I'm good.
Awesome. I love your hat.
Thank you.
We got 2 people with hats. It's exciting. Okay. We also have with us the remarkably, wonderfully talented Rox of Spaz House from NeedCoffee.com. Weekend Justice. How are you, Rox?
I'm good. You're finally in the Spaz House lair.
Oh, I know, right? It's pretty exciting.
Just so you know, you can't see Spaz House from Google Earth.
Oh, really?
Really?
That's good to know. So with us, we're going to be talking about Holmes and the archetype of Holmes, and then getting into the ways in which we see Holmes represented in all sorts of things, from direct iterations like Elementary and BBC Sherlock, and all the way into other iterations and elements that we kind of hint in shows like including Doctor Who. So we're going to go ahead and start off by we're going to go around. What do you guys think makes the Holmesian archetype? Like, what elements make it what it is? Let's start off with Keith.
I think basically what sets it, what makes it unique, and what makes a Holmesian archetype is the Holmes character is the smartest person in the room, and is usually sufficiently smart that he or she is, or they, or it is so far ahead of everybody else that the Watson archetype, which is kind of a necessary component, is usually the only person who can even attempt to keep up with the Holmes archetype. And I think that it's not just the incredibly brilliant detective or whatever, but also paired up with a Watson archetype. I think that particular dynamic is one of the things that makes it unique. Okay,
Trisha, what do you think?
I very much agree with what Keith said as well. To me, at least when I also watch or read any of the Holmes, there's also a certain aspect that a lot of times gets lumped somewhere on the autistic Asperger's spectrum, where you have a different way of connecting with people, of how you read people. And I think that's also an important part of Holmes, is that he has this ability to read people in a way that most people don't, because there's a distance between his ability to relate to them. He also has this sense of almost an obsession with needing to know the truth. And I think that's also a very important part of the archetype as well.
Okay, all right. Bob, what do you think?
I think it's basically the power of the deduction, where everybody's looking at who done it or how did this happen, and he is so far ahead of everybody else. And I think everybody loves to be in a position where you're trying to catch up and figure out, well, how did he figure that out? And so I think that's what keeps everybody interested, because you're engaged in it. You want to try to keep up with his intellect and his powers of deduction. And I think that's the real draw. And also the eccentricities of, you know, how is this guy so different than other people, than normal, the average person? And people, you know, in their everyday life, they go through life and, you know, they meet lots of people that are the same. But this guy is so eccentric that it creates an interest. So the powers of deduction and the eccentricity.
Okay, all right, Rox.
All of the above. But my thing is on Watson. To me, Watson is the closest person we can get to Holmes. He's us. I mean, we all have our varying degrees of intelligence. So Watson is the approachable person we can, you know, out of the duo. There is a clinical aspect to Holmes, which is needed, considering everything when he was created is new. So the ideas that he, proposes on deduction was new in the field of, police work. So that's what's fascinating from a historic point of view for me, is everything then was new, but it still carries through now. So.
Okay, Jennifer, what do you think?
I think when I'm thinking about Holmes as an archetype and not just the character himself, I think of comparisons to, say, him and Father Brown, and then you get into characteristics like they notice things that others miss. You could have noticed it, but you didn't. So for Sherlock, it might be, a detail about their clothing. For Father Brown, it might have been an action that was contrary to their personality. Sherlock has great insight, and for him it comes from academia, but just speaking to the archetype, Father Brown has it he hears confession all the time. He has insight into humans. Mm-hmm. And they both have a passion. For Sherlock, it would be justice. For Father Brown, it would be salvation. But so I guess observation, insight, and passion, those are all crucial to the archetype of Sherlock Holmes.
Okay.
That's actually, if I can just throw in one quick thing, what Jennifer mentioned about how every time Sherlock makes observations about something, it's always something that whoever he's telling it to thinks after he explains it. It's always, oh, right, of course, it's right there. It's not anything he pulls out of his ass. It's stuff that is noticeable if you're just paying close enough attention. And that's always been an important component of, certainly of Conan Doyle's works and the better archetypes, is that it's not magic. It's all stuff that is observable phenomena if you're paying close enough attention.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I'm surprised we haven't mentioned his hubris and the level of hubris that he has. I mean, to me, I think that, yes, check all of the above, agreed on it. I think we can all say that all of these things fit into Holmesian archetype, but I also think the character's struggle with hubris is something that, you see either they lay it on thick, or it's, like you mentioned, Jennifer, Father Brown, which is one of my favorite, iterations of him. And it's there, but he's also, humble about it a little bit. And it's like, he has this like secret opinion of like, you're going to figure out that I'm right.
But it took a while for the humbling, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think with going back to, okay, he's the foundation, the hubris was allowed, his hubris allowed, and I know this is different panel, Agatha Christie's Poirot to have that hubris, So, but I think for me, it was, the softening of, the humility came later in the stories.
Agreed. Yeah, because you see him kind of release to Watson a lot, especially like Hounds of Baskerville, right? He leaves in the Hounds of Baskerville and then comes back at the end to kind of like explain who done it in the story. So on that note, now that we've kind of established what the Holmesian archetype involves, what is your, oh man, that's Sherlock Holmes, or that's a Holmesian thing that a character has done in the role of actually playing Sherlock? Because we have various iterations of, TV series and films and all sorts of things. So what is your favorite? Start with Tricia. What is your like, oh yeah, that's spot on.
Actually, my favorite, honestly, is the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes. To me, because he had the hubris, totally, but he also had that passion that Jennifer brought up of trying to solve it, like the actual excitement of the hunt and of knowing and being able to elicit this joy out of figuring out the crime. Like the fact that he's looking for stuff to solve because that's part of his passion and his obsession. And I thought we really got to see that the way Robert Downey Jr. played him in the movies.
Okay, Rox?
As far as, I think most people will say the Jeremy Brett is the canon of Holmes. As far as, wow, I will say I'm going on a limb. I'm going on a limb on this one, and I'm going to say, because it just brings me joy. I love this movie. Is the Ben Kingsley film with Michael Caine?
Yes, I was hoping somebody would bring that up. Without a clue.
Yes, I love that because it just breaks it. He knows I mean, I think they sort of really based him on Dr. Bell anyway, correct? But I just love that. I mean, everybody else has their points and stuff, and it just sort of skews. I'm sort of a and I've said this before, I'm a Doyleist, so I could see the iterations and stuff. And I just recently saw the William Gillette silent film that was released. But I love, that gives me such joy, is the Ben Kingsley.
Okay, all right. Keith, what do you think?
In terms of screen interpretations, I got to go with Jeremy Brett also, because of all the Holmeses that I've seen performed, Brett is the voice I hear when I read Conan Doyle stories. I don't hear anybody else. That's the voice that and the voice, the expressions, the mannerisms, and so on. I really think do that. I do want to mention one other one that isn't a screen version, but a literary version, which Laurie King's Mary Russell books. Which involve a much older Sherlock Holmes and a young woman named Mary Russell. I always cite these books as an example of books of why there's no such thing as a bad idea. There's only bad execution. These books are a terrible idea. They're an absolutely horrible idea, and they're incredibly brilliant. King does a wonderful job of writing an older Sherlock Holmes, as well as a young woman who can keep up with him, who's as smart as he is. And the relationship that develops between the two of them is amazing. She does a wonderful job of portraying early 20th century life through World War I and beyond into the 20s and 30s. And it's a really wonderful continuation of Conan Doyle's work.
Okay. All right, Jennifer, what do you think?
I think that I enjoy the Elementary and the Sherlock versions. Elementary, the actor's name is escaping me, but
Johnny Miller.
Benedict in Sherlock, because in both of those iterations, we get to see not only the benefit of the genius and he notices things that nobody else noticed, he can pull it together, but you also get to see the downside to that, the difficulties. There's a trade-off there. Yeah, they've got this brilliance and this attention to detail, but other areas of their life suffer. Their interpersonal skills are not what they perhaps could be. And I appreciate, maybe from a psychological standpoint, that kind of balance, and that you can't really have everything.
Okay, all right. And Bob, what do you think?
I'm going to agree with Jennifer on the Sherlock with Benedict and Martin Freeman. I love the relationship between the two of them. And I think that they really play off each other very well. And I also like the hubris that Benedict brings to it, where he kind of like looks down at Scotland Yard or the police, and you know that he's smart and he's figuring it out, and they are left in the dust. They can't figure it out, and they have to depend on him to get the job done. And how he revels in that. And I think Benedict really comes across with that hubris where, you know, you can really see how he revels in that. And I think also with him and Martin Freeman, I just think Martin Freeman really plays a subdued Watson, but yet is his own person. I just think you couldn't do a better job of two actors playing off each other for those two roles.
Yeah, and that's a great point. You know, one of the tenets of characterization is the effect that a character has on another character, as well as what the other characters have on, you know, the character that you're characterizing. But in examining that, you have these relationships that, of course, as Rock said, you know, you have to acknowledge. You have to acknowledge, you know, every single, from villains to the brother to Watson, you know, and take a look at that. So as far as pairings, what other shows, and maybe even Sherlock iterations, or other things you think demonstrate that kind of dynamic as far as the two are concerned? Rock, what do you think?
Going on a limb is Hannibal, the TV series. You know, he's, other than the fact he knows how to think like a killer, because he is one, there is that dynamic for both of them, you know, of, you know, at least the first season of being friends, and they're helping each other solve crimes, even though Hannibal is 5 steps ahead, opposed to a couple steps for Sherlock. So it almost goes beyond that. So that's that, and that's a beautiful show. Whoever is the stylist for that show, that, you know, to me, that's an outside of the box without saying this is Sherlock. So,
Okay, all right, Keith, what do you think?
My favorite Holmes pastiche on that I've seen is Law and Order: Criminal Intent. Robert Gorin and Alexandra Eames are basically Holmes and Watson on the NYPD.
Yeah.
And I mean, I could watch both Vincent D'Onofrio and Catherine Irby do pretty much anything.
Right.
I mean, they could read the phone book and they'd make it entertaining. But the two of them work beautifully together, and D'Onofrio in particular just does a wonderful job of creating a modern Holmesian character. That is very much a Holmesian archetype, both in terms of the brilliance and in terms of the hubris and of being spectacularly screwed up, like Bob and Jennifer both mentioned. And I think it's beautifully done, and it's one, like I said, it's one of my favorites.
Yeah, all right.
Didn't he go on record and say that D'Onofrio say that he did base his portrayal on Holmes?
Oh yeah. No, it was very obviously meant to be.
Yeah.
And Eames also is supposed to be Watson. She's, you know, she's the only one who can keep up with him.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Trish, what do you think?
This is reaching back some time, but did anyone ever watch Bones when it was on? And I thought that was a really good, almost mashup of it, because the character of Bones herself was the one with the hubris who was actually 5 steps ahead, but she wasn't the detective. She was the one that the detective went to. And the interplay between her and David Boreanaz really worked, because David Boreanaz had to figure out and explain and relate what was going on to the audience based on what she did. So that one was a really interesting take on it, where you played with the deductive reasoning, the hubris, the smarter than everyone else in the room by 5 steps, but not the detective.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. Jennifer?
All right, as you guys are talking about hubris and talking to the police, talking down to them, I'm thinking 60s Batman. And you know,
that was good.
You go back and watch those and hear him talk to the police. I'm like, I'm like, now that's hubris, and that's what's coming to my mind now. And he has his Watson and Robin,
Right.
you know, who is sort of there to praise him and tell him how brilliant he is, while simultaneously offering some help. But
Mhm.
Batman,
Alfred is Mrs. Hudson.
Oh, interesting. Bob, what do you think?
I'm gonna go with House, even though he's
Yes.
not a detective, because I mean that guy's he's a million miles ahead of everybody else. He's all banged up. I mean, he's got all kinds of problems. He's eccentric, and I think it's just that he is the smartest guy in the room, and everyone's trying to figure out. And it's something that you should have saw. He's telling all the other doctors and nurses and people around him, well, why didn't you see this? This was so obvious. So the power of deduction is there. And then I'm going to go with a different one. A modern one is Luther, the show Luther.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I saw an article recently where the writer said she based the character partially on Holmes and partially on Columbo, which I didn't really get the Columbo aspect, but on Holmes,
The jacket.
Luther is figuring Luther is figuring it all out, and everybody else in the room is scrambling, and he's the first one to know what's going on, and the rest of them are just stumbling along and taking his lead, And so those two, House and Luther.
Yeah, I was thinking.
House was very deliberate, by the way. That was, I mean, his name, House Holmes, and his had a sidekick named Wilson.
Yeah.
Very deliberate.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think of like DCI Banks and Whitechapel, which are British crime shows. Whitechapel specifically, deals with the Jack the Ripper serial killer, element of it. But I always got this vibe. The main character was like, he's Holmes. He's got a lot of hubris. He's got a lot of different ways of approaching things, of thinking things differently. And it makes me also think of Ripper Street as well, only mostly because of the obviously Jack the Ripper tie, but also the way that in the first couple of episodes, with the female murder and different things happen, I was like, this is a study in pink. Like, it's this formula, and I think that for me was kind of interesting. So, what about some obscure stuff that you think it's close, but it may have been not exactly Holmes, but you could see it there. So let's start with Jennifer. What do you think?
Murdoch mysteries.
Ooh.
You've got Detective Murdoch and George Crabtree.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a very similar dynamic there.
Between the two of them? Okay, that's interesting. Keith, what do you think?
Actually, this is a little. This one's a little off, but it kind of sort of applies. The Adventures of Briscoe County Jr.
Yeah.
With Lord Bowler and Watson. That because Briscoe was, in the same way that Holmes was, not a standard detective for the time at which he was written, but was much smarter than the average and sort of worked outside it. Briscoe was not a standard cowboy. He wasn't the rough. He was an actual intellectual cowboy, which was practically a contradiction in terms, at least in terms of Western tropes, if not necessarily the reality. And so and he often would, much like Holmes. I mean, one of the things about Holmes was that he was kind of on the bleeding edge of the technology and the forensic techniques of the time. And Briscoe is the same way. His whole thing with the coming thing and the change in technology, which Murdoch Mysteries does also, with all the coming with the advent of steam and of harnessing steam and electricity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Okay.
Was less observing what other people could have seen and more they didn't realize these things could have been seen until he built the devices necessary to see them.
Yeah. Bob, what do you think?
I'm going to go with maybe MacGyver, because he had that little bit about him where he was, figuring out things ahead of everyone else, so, but not quite, there's a lot of them that's not Holmes. So you're saying is it's off. So I don't see Holmes in it, but I see enough of it in it where it makes me think about, that there's a connection.
Okay. Tricia?
I was looking up the name. Yeah. Okay, so did anyone watch in its iteration the Holmes and Houdini? It was a series. That one was the character who played Holmes, and I was trying to look it up. Just didn't strike it for me. He wasn't proud enough, and he wasn't quite smart enough for that role. And while I enjoyed the show, it wasn't Holmes. There was so much that just didn't ring true with that. And it was supposed to be Holmes and Houdini.
That's fair. It's like the I can't remember if it's China or Chinese or Japanese. There was the Miss Sherlock that was made where it was, I think it only had like one season, and it was it's completely obscure and random, but it's pretty interesting. It was not quite as spot on as you would hope that it would be, like what you were mentioning. Rox, what do you think?
Well, I'm going to say that if anything, Sherlock is able to allow other people to create from that. So I'm going to go with the Thin Man series. It's a bit of a stretch, but you have,
Hubris.
You have very flawed character. You have his Watson, which is his wife. You get a dog too, but he has that same sort of connection with the police. It's not, and then there's that screwball comedy type aspect. So, but in the heyday of Hollywood, everybody based stuff off of Sherlock Holmes. So that's my take of it. So
I mean, yeah, you got the whole mentioning of just like Doctor Who, Star Trek.
Yeah.
Right. We've got that kind of going on. So as far as like big media is concerned, what is it that when you watch a show, you say to yourself, that's Moriarty. Like he's got that nod to Moriarty as far as that being a part of who Sherlock is, right? Let's start.
Not really.
You don't think so?
Okay. This is my own personal thing. I hate the character of Moriarty.
Okay.
Anytime a Sherlock Holmes adaptation uses Moriarty in it, it diminishes it in my eyes, because Moriarty is not an important part of the Sherlock Holmes canon. He was created as a plot device by Conan Doyle to get rid of Holmes. That failed. He is not a character at all. The final problem, I love Conan Doyle's work. I love the Holmes stories. I love every single one of them, except the final problem, which I think is one of the worst stories written in the English language by an otherwise talented author. Moriarty isn't a character at all. He's like I said, he's a plot device. He's just there to kill Holmes and to be retroactively inserted unconvincingly into the previous stories. He's the least interesting character in the entire Holmes mythos, and the constant use of him drives me bug nuts. The combination of Moriarty with Irene Adler. I loved that. That was brilliant. But overall, I hate the character of Moriarty, so I don't look for him anywhere because he's stupid.
That's I appreciate your passion, but
apparently the passion was so great it killed my modem. So yeah.
But the truth is that like this is a character that Holmes has to deal with, right? And in dealing with Moriarty, and even when in dealing with his brother, you have this element that's added to the Holmesian archetype of having to cope with a clear opposite, because he does have this equal and he has this hubris, but there's also this other character that's seemingly to put him in check, so to speak, as well as his brother. So in that guise, Trisha, what do you think like other shows that kind of do this?
I mean, for me, I've always you brought up Doctor Who a few times, and that's actually one of the first ones that comes to mind, is the Master being the Moriarty to the Doctor. Very much just as smart, just as proud, and literally, and even borrowing from Keith, like his entire purpose is to undo the Doctor. Like he is kind of a plot device to do that too. And that's kind of what he was written for. So to me, the master on Doctor Who is very much a Moriarty. And I actually think that when we had Missy, played by Michelle Gomez, that really embodied that the most. You really got to see the multiple steps ahead, and the hubris of that, like a calm hubris. So that is probably one of my favorite iterations of Moriarty.
Okay, Bob, what do you think?
I go with Luther again. I might be drawing a blank here, but I think it's Alice. I think is her name.
Yeah,
The
Alice,
one-
yeah.
Right, Alice. I mean, that is the perfect Moriarty. Sometimes she's one step ahead of Luther. He's going looking to her to help him with the case that he has, but she's almost like Holmes, where she has no emotion, and he's the guy that has emotion, is trying to help people. And you can see a certain compassion in Luther that you don't see in Holmes. But yet Alice is more like Holmes in that she's blank. She's like a blank, slate. And I just find it really interesting that, here he is and she knocks him down a peg because he's so far ahead of everyone else. But yet Alice is ahead of him a lot of times, and she's brilliant in her own right. So I think that's just perfect.
Yeah, big time. Jennifer, what do you think?
All right. For fans of Terry Pratchett, do you remember the moment when Granny Weatherwax is talking about her sister who went the evil path, right? And she has that moment where she's so angry with her because she's like, because you were the evil one, I had to be the good one. Do you know how amazingly evil I could have been?
Mm-hmm.
Now, to me, this is how I see Moriarty. He is the what if they'd gone the other way. And I think the best portrayals of that will be the ones where you get to see Granny's anger in the Holmes character. You're in a sense more free than I am. You're using all of this. You're not hampered by morals or the law or anything. I could have done that better, but this is my role. So for me, that's sort of the purpose of the Moriarty.
Okay, all right, Rox.
I'm going to go with Keith a little bit. That yes, he's a construct, because even in comics you need that foil, and it's time and time again. It doesn't matter what superhero. There's always the Luther. There's always, whatever villain of the month. If you look at, there was a really cool commentary for Silence of the Lambs. So Hannibal, there is no such person as a Hannibal. It was like an amalgam of that. So I think writers now, it's like we need a constant like super villain all the time. But I'll say the best iteration of a Moriarty, I'm going to go with Star Trek Next Generation, because here he is an AI.
Oh, right.
And it's like, oh crap. And it was like that oh crap moment. It's like, oh, he's accessed stuff. What the hell do we do?
Right.
So that's the scary part of a trope like Moriarty. It's like, even into the future, you're like, oh yeah, that's like Sherlock Holmes. He does bad. To me, it's a great way of you're moving the story forward, just like Terry Pratchett. It's like, hey, we have this go-to,
Right.
because we need a story, and you always need a foil. So
okay, well, what about
Rox made me think of another good one from comic books, which is Dr. Doom.
Yeah,
because Victor Von Doom is basically Reed Richards'
foil.
Yeah.
foil, and basically Reed gone bad. They're basically the same person, but each is as smart as the other, and that really is what Conan Doyle was trying to do with the Holmes Moriarty thing, and it's actually and it's very much in the same vein as the Doctor and the Master and so on. So
which is funny, because that's something Agatha Christie really doesn't have, like a main villain in her series.
No.
So I think.
Dorothy Sayers.
Pardon?
I was thinking Dorothy Sayers, Lord Peter Wimsey, who are both Poirot and Wimsey are very much inspired by Holmes too. So.
Yeah, this is true. So what about like individual stories that we see in other iterations? Like, you know, I mentioned the Hounds of Baskerville before, which we see in Being Human, right? In the BBC Being Human series. As far as this kind of idea of this story. So what story and what representation of that story were you just like, oh, this is totally whatever, you know, story about Sherlock? Let's start with Keith. What do you think?
Oh, I was really hoping you weren't going to start with me.
I'm with you on that one.
Oh, actually, I sort of the back to Law and Order: Criminal Intent again. Every time they used the character of Nicole Wallace, played by Olivia Dabo, which was, you could argue was a Moriarty character, but really was kind of a mix of both his Moriarty and his Irene Adler in a lot of ways. And I got a lot more, particularly in her first couple of appearances, the vibe I got off her was a lot closer to A Scandal in Bohemia than it was to The Final Problem. So I'd say that one, that's one example.
Okay. All right. Jennifer, what do you think?
I'm going to go back to Murdoch Mysteries with the bad guy, James Gillies. He literally jumped off a bridge into the water.
Yeah.
After him. I mean, so I think that's the final problem. No question about it.
Okay. Trisha, what do you think?
I don't have a good answer for that one. I'm sorry. I'm trying to think of, because I see little bits and pieces here and there in different, and I'm trying to pick out which one I like better. And I don't have a good answer to that one. So let me pass on this one.
That's okay. That's totally fine. Rox, what do you think?
Wow. I don't, as what Trisha was saying is he's so prevalent. So it's like, to me, whatever story has the locked room story, and we've seen that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
Luther's had it. I just watched one movie last night, The Mystery of the 13th Guest. That kind of had it. So I don't have specific, but what Study in Scarlet had the locked room, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that has shown up. I think even Murder, She Wrote had one.
Murdoch Mysteries had one.
Yeah, this is true.
Mm-hmm.
Bob, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to pass on this one as well. I can't think of one. You know, I'm just thinking of generalities. You know, like you know, like the Mind Palace. I'm thinking like the Mentalist. You know, that you know he had that.
Yeah.
But that's, you know, that he was very much into the mental aspect of it in the Mentalist, and that's what, you know, the whole Mind Palace thing. But that's a generality. That's not a specific. That's answering a question.
Yeah, I know, and I knew this would be a tough question because it is more about. This is why we call the panel the Holmesian archetype, because it is more about the archetype and how these little aspects we find in media, from audio to comic books to television to films, that we see this Holmesian archetype. So I knew it would be a tough question to kind of, you know, tackle. But you are right. We do see things like that. I think of like White Collar, right? I think of White Collar. I loved White Collar, and every time I watch it, I'm like, that's Holmes. Like that's who he is. Or a little thing will happen. Or
well, wait a minute. Who is Holmes in White Collar, do you think?
I mean, I think I can't remember his name. It's been
Neil.
I don't think Neil necessarily is.
Yeah, to me, Peter was
Peter.
Yeah.
I couldn't remember his name. I was like, what is his name?
But Neil had the more abstract knowledge, like Holmes. He was the one that knew these weird little tidbits that other people wouldn't. But I think you could almost argue that Peter was his Moriarty. and they
Flip it, you know.
Or maybe Peter was Mycroft, like in that, right? Like,
that's better.
Yeah, possibly, yeah.
I like that there wasn't such a power differential. They were both really smart, and he reminded him several times throughout the series, just so you know, I'm still smarter than you.
Yeah.
I still caught you.
Right.
He's like, and that's twice. and
And he was never able to stay very far ahead of Peter for more than like an episode. You know.
And I love that they never kept a cliffhanger, like any kind of deception. They never dragged it on.
Yeah.
They always resolved that pretty quickly, which was again a nod to the fact that there wasn't that disparity.
Yeah.
Like you said, it didn't pull them long.
Yeah.
And I think that the whole like Agatha Christie pseudo like Arthur Conan Doyle trope when it comes to the object left in the right place that only he finds and he realizes is a clue, I think is something that is very close to the Holmesian archetype. So we see it in Father Brown, we see it in so many things, right? What were you gonna say, Bishop?
No, I was going to say, but that also, the thing left, those clues also come out in Poe's mysteries as well. Where you get the Scarlet Pimpernel and all those, you've got those little tiny, that deductive clues, that comes up in Poe, even with aside from Holmes too.
Yeah, that's a pretty solid point. So what even Clue, right?
Yes.
And the board game and Heston.
And the movie. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
I mean, who saw Knives Out?
Yeah.
I mean, that was awesome with
Daniel Craig's
blanking
character.
on
Daniel
the-
Craig, yeah.
Yes. I mean, that was obviously very meant to be purposefully like almost a Holmes pastiche.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Or Midsummer Murders, excuse me.
Sorry, don't know where I was going with that. Just popped into my head.
And it makes me think of Lie to Me, which is kind of like Holmes, but not
Sexualized. It's specifically facial expressions he notices that other people don't. Definitely hubris. Lots of
big time. But the fact that the deductive thought process, right, that he goes through. I mean, obviously in the BBC Sherlock, we actually get to see him enter his mind palace several times, which I thought was a very good, interpretation of it. Rox?
We haven't talked about Monk.
Oh yeah.
Oh my God, yes.
See, and then Monk also exemplifies that there's downside to thrill.
Yes.
But there's also what do you say? It's a gift and a curse.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another one we haven't mentioned is Psych.
Yes.
I'm watching that right now with my 11-year-old.
Yeah.
And one of the
what's interesting is playing on what Jennifer was just saying. Every time there's a modern interpretation of Holmes, whether it's a direct one like the Downey Jr. films or or Johnny Lee Miller's version in Elementary, or Benedict Cumberbatch's in Sherlock, or just bringing it forward in a more abstract way like it does with Psych or with Monk, is that they always tend to focus on one particular aspect of Holmes and expand it. With Downey Jr., it was the obsession. With Miller, it was the addiction, and how addiction would be treated differently in the early 21st century than it would have been in the late 19th. And then he's actually gone through rehab and is in 12-step program. Others, focus more on what Trisha was mentioning before about the autistic Asperger's spectrum version aspects of the character. Monk focusing on, the post-traumatic stress. Everybody seems to take like one aspect of the character and focus on that rather than use all of it in a modern interpretation,
which allows for breadth for each character and stuff. So it's like it's based on but then becomes unique, which still gives homage to the original source.
One of the things that we didn't touch on, I don't think, is the archetypal aspect of going outside the rules. breaking the rules, willing to, you know, because everybody else is like playing by the rules. And then, you know, like Benedict, he doesn't have a problem going outside the standard rules. You know, it's almost like Luther, he doesn't have a problem going outside the rules. You know, so that's one of the archetypal aspects that we just didn't touch upon that I think is very important. And I think a lot of people like that because, you know, in your normal everyday life, you have to play by the rules or you get in trouble. And you look at this guy and he's going outside the rules and you say, wow, wouldn't that be great if I could go outside the rules like that, like he does, you know?
House was another one that did that very well.
So,
What was that?
go ahead, Trish.
I was going to say House is another one that does that very well, the breaking the rules and playing with that in the medical setting and the potential consequences of that. It was another fun thing that House did, playing with the Sherlock trope and the Sherlock archetype.
Keith?
But he also, part of the reason why Holmes in particular worked outside the rules is because he was so far ahead of everybody else. Which also is the same thing with the 66 Batman that Jennifer mentioned, which I never thought of before as a Holmes archetype, but it totally is. Because he also had more advanced techniques than the Gotham City Police did. He had all the 50 toys in the Batcave, and Holmes was the same way. He was outside the system because he was more advanced than the system was.
Yeah, that's a really great point. You know, and it also makes me think about, you know, to go back to Father Brown. You know, he breaks the rules, and he gets in trouble. You know, he's gotten arrested a couple of times, but it's interesting to see the way that this is being used. You know, Neil, he breaks the rules in White Collar excessively, and you have these different things that it's like how he goes about it is based on the writing, but it's obvious that it is Sherlock.
Right.
Do you think we like a character like Sherlock because yes, you said he breaks the rules, because in order to have a job like Bob had, you have to have X amount of training. We just can't become detectives. You know, so here we have a very smart individual who I can think this way, and the police see that. So it's almost like our wish to do.
Well, that's what. I agree with you, and that's why they have him. And the character is an amateur detective. In other words, he's not within the police force, and that's why it's specifically written that way, so that you, as the regular person, can identify with it. You know, because you're not a detective. So in order for you to be able to identify with the character, that's why I think they make him an amateur detective, even though he's far from amateur, you know?
Yeah, or they give him some sort of out, like a license to kill, right?
Right.
It's fun, you know, like it you know, makes me kind of think of that a little bit. You think about Q, and you think about the Sean Connery iteration, you know, specifically. You know, yes, he's more rough and tumble and rough around the edges, but it's like he gets an out in some way, which is kind of interesting because the character gets a pass, right?
Absolutely.
Sherlock Holmes gets a pass on a lot of things.
Right, which, going back to the monk thing, him being away from the police, still has, you know, sources with the police.
Right.
He could now do stuff outside of.
The perfect example of that is the Rockford Files. He's got his friend. He's got his friend Jim. Jim's in the, you know, and he always relying on Dennis. I'm sorry, Dennis, and he's relying on Dennis to get inside information, even though he's on the outside of the system. He's got a guy on the inside, Dennis. You know, so that comes into play, and that comes into play in a lot of different adaptations of Holmes. You know,
Trisha, do you see that anywhere else?
Which part? The going to the police, breaking the rules.
I think having a friend within the police that they can go to, or someone, you know, that they can tap into.
Or having an out, like they have a pass.
That's in a lot of things. And of course now I'm drawing a blank because we're just okay. So I'm currently watching the newest season of Lucifer, which plays with a lot of Holmes stuff. But So it's almost a reversal where you've got the police, the officer, Decker, who has an outside of the police connection. But then Lucifer also uses her as inside police. A lot of actually all of the Marvel shows like Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, all of them had an in with the police, and they were also working outside of it. Not necessarily. Well, actually, a lot of them also had a fair amount of hubris and different angles on it. But with the superhero aspect, but that in with the police, that ability to work outside the law, just comes up very often in a lot of cases with comic book styled mysteries, whether you're dealing with superpowers or like the classic noir comics and all of those. There's almost always the detective is working outside or is specifically an amateur detective, but they have a friend who is on the police or used to be on the police who can give them that in.
Yes, that's a good point. Jennifer, what do you think?
Insofar as I think most of the PI stories I'm familiar with, they were either formerly law enforcement or have an unrelated in with law enforcement. But I think that just makes sense. They tend to have that skill set, and Republic of Doyle, right?
Yes.
Right, so there you have a PI with an in with the police that he had to work at.
Yeah, it makes me think of like Grant Chester is another like sort of similar to Father Brown kind of thing going on, but it's like he gets a pass almost on his hubris because of either his job role or because of how smart he is or how good he is at deducing, or she, like in the case of what they're doing or the way that they're interacting with the Holmesian archetype. So it's pretty fascinating.
One of the examples, it would be Raymond Chandler, Philip Marlowe. When you talk about the noir, Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe, those guys are outside the rules. They're outside the law. The only difference between those guys, that American crime-fighting film noir guy is not refined like the British version of Holmes. Holmes is an intellect. Those guys are more, rough and tumble, and they're just like breaking all the rules, and they're destined to be in for a world of trouble, at the end. In those noir, everybody's, in the end, they're getting their due. It's a big difference between the British detective who, like Holmes, who's really relying on that intellect and so forth,
Yeah, Keith?
I was just going to mention that the whole idea of the consulting detective is one that still clings now. Monk is one example. Psych is another example. Castle is another example. Lucifer is an example of somebody who is not part of the police force, who nonetheless works with the police force the way Holmes often worked with Scotland Yard to help solve crimes. And Bowles.
Yeah, that's a good point. Rox?
Oh, wow. Okay, so you have Dexter. You have... Again, I'm going to go back to Hannibal. And I'm going to go with Jessica Fletcher as well. With especially Dexter and Hannibal, the series, he's called in as an expert. They have their own crew, dealing with Lawrence Fishburne's character and stuff. So there is a lot of hubris, and it's hidden amongst his, suaveness. Dexter, I do know, since he's a splatter expert, never watched too much of the show. I saw enough to say, oh yeah, okay, I can see that. And then, Jessica Fletcher always, she knows the police around her. There's too much murder around that woman. I'm just saying.
So as we close out, if you had one singular recommendation about anything related to the Holmesian archetype that you would want to leave our audience with and say, hey, you should really go check this out, what would that be, and why? Let's start off with Jennifer.
Father Brown.
Why Father Brown?
I think because the author of Father Brown was such a huge fan and almost a contemporary of Doyle. But also, honestly, just in the times we're in right now, I need that cozy mystery with all the really vibrant side characters that you love and adore and are just as important to you as the main character. And it just has a more positive spin while still giving you that satisfaction of the murder mystery.
Awesome. Keith, what would you recommend?
I'm going to be horribly self-serving and mention the 2 Baker Street Irregulars anthologies, not just because I'm in both of them, but it's all alternate take on Sherlock Holmes, very much using the archetypes that we've just spent the last hour talking about. And there's both anthologies. They're edited by Michael Ventrella and Jonathan Mayberry, and there's all sorts of really cool stories in them, and I can't recommend them strongly enough. So definitely check that out.
Awesome. Bob?
Yeah, the BBC Sherlock with Benedict and Martin Freeman. I don't think you can beat that. I mean, you can't go wrong with that.
Awesome. Trisha?
I also really enjoyed the Baker Street Irregulars anthologies that Keith mentioned. I've got both of those. And I actually want to, after listening to the whole conversation, kind of call back to House, just because there is so much accurate to how there's so much homage to the Holmes archetype, but it does take in a totally different direction by looking into the medical field as opposed to outright crime solving.
Okay, and Rox?
All right, I'm going to go old school. So in 2016, they actually found the film, it was in France, of William Gillette's performance as Sherlock Holmes. And that was his play that Conan Doyle said, yes, go ahead with. So that his portrayal is the first Sherlock. You can find it on YouTube. It's really worth seeing. The accompanying music, I think turn it down a little bit, but it gives you a good portrayal. And also there is a recording you can find online of his speech, of his there's some voice recording of him as Sherlock, and it's very close to Jeremy Brett. So I'm gonna recommend this. It's Life and Letters. So this is Arthur Conan Doyle writing lifelong to his mother, and there's a good reference to William Gillette in the books because he was hoping. This is the cool thing about Sherlock, really quick, is he is the first multimedia fictional character, and he was counting on making money. There you go.
Nice. My final recommendation that I think that is actually worth anyone's time is it was co-produced by BBC and WGBH Boston and a PBS station. It's only 6 episodes, but it's Murder Rooms: Mysteries of the Real Sherlock Holmes. And it centers on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as the actual main character and him working with his mentor, Dr. Joseph Bell. And it is so good. I highly, highly recommend it. You can find it on Amazon, I think. And but it's a brilliant show. So thank you so much for being here as we've been digging into the Holmesian archetype. I appreciate everybody's time. And those of you who are watching, you can find the BritTrack at BritTrack on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So thank you again, and have a wonderful Dragon Con. Bye, guys.
Take care, everybody.
Bye, thank you.